Well, the story for this week is Jesus' parable of the rich fool. And this parable is one of what I would call the shock therapy stories of the gospel. The sounds of the story are fairly apparent in the sound map, but I'll just call attention to some of the dimensions of that. The introduction is to the crowd. Someone in the crowd said to him, now that crowd was introduced at the beginning of chapter 12 as being thousands of people who were trampling on each other. So it's a big crowd. So someone in the crowd then was yelling out, teacher, tell my brother. And so Jesus is addressing this big crowd, and he told the parable to them. So it's big. Another dimension of the sound is then that when he starts the parable, the first part of it is that the rich man is talking to himself. So that's relatively quiet. Given the crowd, the land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, what am I going to do? I don't have any place to store my crops. And then he said, and so that part of the parable is relatively slow and quiet. But then there's this long period of, this is what I'll do. I'll pull down my barns, build bigger ones. There I'll store all of my grain, and I'll say to my soul, soul. So it just goes faster. It's fast, and it gets louder and louder until the end of it. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. So that episode is a big crescendo that is indicated by both the length of this period. There are 5 cola in it, 6, but then he said, and then the last one is slower but is the climax of that whole thing. Then the last part is God speaking to him. And this is God speaking directly to the man at night. And so this is quiet and slow. God said to him, fool, fool, however you want to do it. This night, your life is being demanded of you. And as for all these things that you've prepared, whose will they be? And then Jesus' last comment is so on. So you can sense from the structure of the story and its sound, the way in which it builds up to the climax of this rich man's celebration that he's got it made, and then God just... So it's relatively easy to identify the sound structure of this parable. The mnemonic structure of it, that is remembering how it's structured so that you can tell it, the first part is structured by the man in the crowd who asked him the question. Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance. And Jesus said to him, hold it, friend. Who made me a judge or arbitrator over you? So he first of all responds in terms of the structure. It's the question, tell my brother, it's actually the command, tell my brother. Jesus refuses, saying, who set me up as a judge or an arbitrator over you? And then he says to the crowd, beware of all kinds of greed. So the structure of it is statement, Jesus' refusal, and beware of greed. And then the parable. Now, the parable is structured by, first, the man saying to himself, what should I do? And then he says, this is what I will do. What should I do? I have no place to store my crops. This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I'll store my crops. So you've got, what should I do? This is what I'll do. Store my crops. There I'll store all my grain and my goods. And then the final address is to his soul. And again, it's a verbal thread. Soul, you have goods stored up for many years. And the last part of this is that, in terms of remembering it, is that the rich man says, soul, you have all this. God said, fool. So it's soul and fool. So the parable is structured to make it easy to remember. So if you just pay attention to those mnemonic structures, you'll remember it easily. Now, the power of this parable is related to a dynamic that is present in many of Jesus' parables, which is that he leads his listeners into identification with a character who is then judged by God, or who does something that is radically wrong. In this case, he invites his listeners to identify with this terrible dilemma that this rich man has. It's the envy of everybody. Oh gosh, I wish they had that problem, that my fields have produced so much that I don't have any place to store them. And it builds to the climax of his rejoicing at, so this is Price is Right and the $1 million thing and somebody winning and da-da-da. This is the rich man. It has that dynamic to it. And what happens in the parable then is that when God says, fool, it is addressed to the listeners, and they have identified with the character to whom it's addressed. So it is heard and experienced as being addressed to every listener. Fool. And the impact of this structure is always to make one think, to shock one into thinking about this issue. And in this case, the issue is rejoicing in and celebrating about having a whole lot of stuff and placing your life and your spirit in your investments and in the goods that you have accumulated and placing your security there. And that is set in the context of, tonight might be the end of your life. And so where do you want to invest your money? Do you want your life? Do you want to invest it in things that don't last, or do you want to invest it in God, things that do last? So the parable then, in effect, requires its listeners, anybody who identifies with the rich man, to think about it. And in relation to the character of Jesus' thought, it's also reflected in this parable, which is to think back from the future. So Jesus is always thinking back from the future of the coming of the kingdom of God and thinking back from that future into the present. So if you think back from either the end of your life or of standing before God at the last judgment, or however you think about that, whatever it is that's out there in the future, to think back from that moment to the present. And how does the present look in light of that future? That's how Jesus is always thinking. So in this case, to think back specifically here from the end of your life and the calculation of value. What is it that at the end of your life you will be able to say, that's something that I'm glad I invested in. And the danger of greed, which is endemic in American culture, is celebrated in movies. I think of the movie Wall Street, where I remember Michael Douglas, in that scene saying, greed is good. Greed is great. We all believe in greed. And that's what this country is about. It's built on greed. Well, there's a sense in which that's true, and that is what has led us into this current mess that we're in the economy and other things. And so we're trying now to figure out ways in a corporate sense to put limits on greed and to control it so that it doesn't subvert the well-being of everybody in the world from people who are greedy. But that's also not just a communal issue, it's a personal issue as to how is it that we now spend the time and resources of our lives and in trying to accumulate more things or in investing things in the kingdom of God and in spiritual values and love and peace and things that will last. So Jesus' last statement then is, that's the way it is, and it's the way it will be with people who store up treasures for themselves but are not rich toward God. So the question that the parable raises is, how can you be rich toward God? How can you invest and become rich in the values and the things of the kingdom of God? In the telling of this story, I would recommend that you enter fully into its spirit and not hold back from the shock of the parable. The problem with the detached reading that we have practiced is that it levels the shock out of the parable so that people then are not invited and in effect required to think about their own values. That's what the parable is doing. And so do it. Don't hold back from making it happen. It's a good thing for your listeners.